V for Vendetta is a terrible film with terrible politics. It trades in all the kitsch of the fevered anti-war movement of its day, to the extent of indulging in false flag conspiracism, which, in a social commentary about the post-9/11 West, is one of the most vile symptoms of social contagion. It is also, I contend, one of the earliest signs in pop culture of the sickness we now suffer from today. It is proto-wokeism, giving succor to the direct and immediate antecedents of the modern woke movement, the anti-war cranks of the mid-noughties, Anonymous, the Occupy movement. Its diagnosis of the social ills of its day is wrong, but the solution it propagates, the kind of amorphous, unformed, felt-not-thought revolution one sees so often now on university campuses and from YouTube communists in their multi-million-dollar mansions, is wildly so. In this video, I'll explain why this bilge, undeservedly popular because too few people have bothered then or now to pay attention to its messaging, is bad, both in technique, it is terrible as a film, and in politics, its messaging is vile. But before I get on to that, if you enjoy this video, or at least if you find it interestingly wrong, do consider hitting the subscribe button. Little Platoon does near daily content on politics and current affairs, as well as film criticism and wider cultural critique. Symbols are an attempt at giving objective expression to a subjective feeling. You can tell a good deal about a culture and its society from the symbols it offers up. Whether designed to be so or not, they are more than mere in-the-moment communication or commentary. Symbols outlast the cultures that create them. This is what makes them useful to history, but it is also what makes them useful diagnostic tools, revealing the state of the cultural psyche, or what some might choose to call the collective consciousness. Do they express a common ideal, or are they expressions of individual genius? Are they made with an eye to posterity, or simply to impress in the moment? Are they meant to accommodate the public, to resonate to its mood, or to tell it something it is not asked to hear? Do they affirm the culture that birthed them? Do they seek to reclaim it for the good, or do they oppose it? Architecture is, by its nature, an especially useful guide to the values of a culture. We have no choice but to look at it, to compare it with its context and setting, and it is far from transient, even where we might wish it to be. When we consider the best of the ancient world, which is still with us, we see totems erected to some common cultural idea or ideal. Temples, churches, and cathedrals may be built by men, and in too many cases on the backs of poor men, but they are not for man. They are expressions of that which they glory: faith, devotion, the celestial, and the transcendental. I'm an atheist, but it causes me no pain to acknowledge the place of religion as a common ideal, a common belief, providing a common set of values. The reason for religious conflict can be found in the answer to the question, common to whom? It can be found in the failure of that ambition coded into both the etymology and the theology of Catholicism and Islam respectively, universalism in the former, universal submission in the latter. Nowadays we lose more churches than we put up, and the modern equivalent of the cathedral is something very different indeed. The money that might once have been contributed by the public or expropriated from it to build a cathedral has been replaced by lucrative contracts given to architects with famous names, financed with hefty endowments from minor Emirati royals and dissident Russian oligarchs. The architect is out not to give expression to the place he is adding to, but to leave his mark upon it, which is what produces London's new skyline, a motley collection of oddly shaped monoliths, and is what ended the age-old symmetry of the Champs de Mars in Paris, the view from atop the Eiffel Tower now scarred by the jutting obelisks of one bank or another. It is a remarkably modern revolution. New York City, for instance, retains a definite sense of self as expressed in an almost uniformity of style, but its effects in countries unlucky enough to suffer through it are near total. The guiding philosophy is that of the architect Otto Silenus in Evelyn Waugh's Decline and Fall, who tears down the lovely Tudor house of King's Thursday and replaces it with a surprising creation of ferro-concrete and aluminium, and who regards the human element as something to be expunged wherever possible. In academia, the trend is captured sublimely by an old lecturer of mine, Patrick Madigan, in his essay Milton's Lucifer and the Cult of the Artist as Genius. This obsession with the moment, with immediacy, will be felt for decades and perhaps centuries to come. It will be felt when our glass spires, never designed for posterity, have either to be expensively kept up or else allowed to fall down. But it will still tell us something about our culture that we barely conceived of at the time, and which likely never entered the mind of the architects involved or their Saudi financiers. This obsession with the immediate likewise finds expression in what we choose to pull down. The modern fanatic's obsession with tearing down statues to men whose history they have never learned, but whom they have judged as sinful nonetheless, reflects the ultimate futility of objective expression through symbols. The symbols of every age will mean something very different to those who live among them in ages hence. Especially where subsequent ages have forgotten the value of history, and where moral education is non-existent. hence the ease with which our children are captured by modern cults imbued with pseudo-religious fervour, which act as a substitute for stunted private morality. Symbols that were once expressions of a common and beneficent ideal will not be vouchsafed by a proper respect for moral relativism. Private failings of the past are deemed public failings today, in something like a reenactment of Savonarola's Bonfire of the Vanities in 15th century Florence, and only a performative kind of public purgation can suffice. It is not enough to look at a statue to Edward Colston and say, well, this great benefactor without whom the city of Bristol could not exist was by our standards a morally dubious human being. He did undoubted good, and he did undoubted bad. We ought to remember this even as we remember that by the standards of his day, his sins were hardly sins, they were indeed common and expected behaviour worldwide. No, the only acceptable way to recontextualise him is to throw him literally in the sea. The same is true of Cecil Rhodes, of Thomas Jefferson, of Abraham Lincoln, of Winston Churchill. Never mind that the good they did was remarkable by the standards of their day and their failings very much not. No, their failings are remarkable by the standards of our day, and we have lived with the good they did long enough to take it for granted. Most conventional philosophy teaches that all things are contingent. What we see are effects with causes that predate them, without which they would not be. Forms of art that are by their nature more immediate are often better tools for identifying causes as they are occurring, or at least shortly after they occur. Film, generally, is a short-term medium. The great stand out for their timelessness, but they are exceptions proving the rule. Casablanca tells us something eternal about our nature, though in the grand scheme of things it is not an especially old work, and its meaning might well be lost if it isn't already being lost, long before the Shard collapses, as the symbols on which it relies, totalitarianism of the Nazi variety, lose their meaning. Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke's 2001: A Space Odyssey asks eternal questions, but is not really a mass-market film, not really a blockbuster. It lacks the pace, the physical and verbal punches to retain a mass audience, though it endures as a work of objective artistic genius, and likely will endure many decades, and one hopes many centuries hence, the movie equivalent of the Parthenon. But we in the moment can better appreciate the mood of our moment through film and the dramatic arts than we can through architecture. It is easier to understand how ice melts by watching an ice cube than it is a glacier. And since it is, or was until recently, Guy Fawkes' night, there is one obvious film with which to demonstrate the point. 2005's V for Vendetta, in which, I contend, we can find an expression of the antecedent cause of a modern totalitarianism, the statue-toppling species of woke, it both encouraged and lacked the wit to anticipate. As should by now be obvious, this is only in a small sense a critique of the film itself. My goal here is to illustrate how the film both captured and gave rise to a social phenomenon, even a social contagion, a form of radicalism which is at once superficial and absolutist, capricious and total, a collectivism that masquerades as individualism, which sings paeans to freedom from tyranny, even as it oppresses and suppresses and, where possible, expunges freedom of thought, of exchange, and of belief. V for Vendetta is especially useful because, though being pretty awful as a film, it has produced a symbol in which all of the above resides, the famous mask, which was the chosen symbol of part of the anti-war movement, anonymous, and most especially of the Occupy movement. Though it has thankfully declined in the years since to something like the seriousness and ubiquity it deserves, it can still be found at various protest movements. Bonfire Night in the UK this year saw people outside Parliament protesting vaccine mandates and lockdown, and sure enough, there was that damned mask again. I'm not sure it has ever been worn by anyone who is not a crank of some description, and is my entry to that red flag meme that briefly did the rounds on Twitter a week or so ago. V for Vendetta is derivative. In its setting it is basely so, in its messaging superficially. Being derivative is not eo ipso a barrier to innovation, and it is occasionally innovative in its imagery. It is a Tchaikovsky film, after all. It is innovative too, drawing from what comic books and their more recent film adaptations do well when they are at their best, in the way it plays on cultural archetypes. I'm sure I'm not the first to point out that the key players in the Avengers each comport with a particularly American ideal of an archetype. In Captain America, we have the dutiful soldier forced reluctantly into conflict for the greater good. In Tony Stark, we have the Silicon Valley billionaire tech wizard embodying the move fast and break stuff mentality that has made the American tech sector so enriching and so destructive. In Peter Parker, we have the misfit high school kid, overlooked by the system but capable of greatness for which he is unlikely ever to take the credit. The Hulk can, loosely, be passed as the archetypal nerd, venting a rage he in reality lacks the power to express. V in V for Vendetta does something similar, though with key differences. The Avengers is in fact culturally affirmative. These archetypes are distinct, they often conflict, but the ultimate message is one of collaboration to pursue a common ideal that seeks not to destroy an existing order, but to further its fundamental goodness. I suspect this is partly the reason for its popularity today, which tends notably, in a way comparable films do not, Star Wars for instance, to transcend the political and cultural divides that are otherwise everywhere felt. It was telling that Captain Marvel, probably the worst received of all the entries, represents an archetype that is both definitively political and definitely oppositional. Its message affirms the cultural values of a faction, and expresses their gripes against the communal optimism against the rest of the cast. Put otherwise, Captain Marvel shows the fundamentally alienating qualities of much modern feminism, which is not prepared to forgive and forget for the greater good of the whole. Rather, it often seems as though that whole is the real enemy, not the alien menace the film puts in to adhere to convention. Brie Larson is never more convincing an actress than a plank of wood could be, but her treatment of the Don, now deservedly memorialized by the guys at EFAP, is the only time she seems to really feel her enemy. Marvel is not known for variety in its individual films, but its meta-morality is in its own way fairly profound. The most important line in any of the films is, to my mind, one often overlooked, from the first ensemble film, when Steve Rogers comments on the retro design of his uniform, and Agent Coulson responds, "With everything that's happening, the things that are about to come to light, people might just need a little old-fashioned." It might even be argued that the Avengers is riding on a wave of cultural reaction to the kind of ideology represented and furthered by V for Vendetta, which is inherently divisive, even as it pretends at a unifying message. V is similarly archetypal, though the concept is not especially personal in the Avengers mould. It is rather an ideological archetype, and in perhaps the key difference with the Avengers, that ideology is both radical and oppositional. Its goal is the overthrow of an irredeemable system, not the furtherance of the system by redemption. V is radicalism personified, while the Avengers are, if anything, conservative, but conservative with a small c. One seeks revolution, the other fights for reform. There are two contexts to keep in mind, the fictional one, the world V inhabits, and the real one, on which the film is commenting with all the subtlety of a brick to the face. The world of V for Vendetta is itself an irony. That George Orwell could write so brilliantly against the use of cliché in prose only for his very name to become a cliché. Who doesn't read the word Orwellian dubiously applied at least once a week? And for his seminal work, 1984, to birth a kind of airstrip kitsch aesthetic beloved of every lazy dystopia-writing hack, is a kind of metaphysical cruelty to one of England's greatest sons. V for Vendetta barely tries to hide what it has taken from its superior forebear. Alan Moore, who authored the comics, declined payment and refused to be credited for the film, which doubtless lost him a lot of money, but was, for reasons of aesthetics if nothing else, probably a wise decision. In its world, a cataclysm has, we are told, left much of the world in ruins, with the virus coupled with a second civil war rendering America for narrative purposes a non-entity. It features in the film only as a propaganda device deployed by the party, here called Norsefire for no especially convincing reason, which likes to brag about how terrible things are across the ocean, much like the party in 1984, which similarly brags about the superiority of its state when compared with either East Asia or Eurasia as the need arises. In V for Vendetta, Airstrip 1, Britain, is a totalitarian nightmare state ruled over by the party, with Big Brother, the High Chancellor, at its head. Honestly, it's impossible not to make comparisons with Orwell because the film does so much to flaunt them. Its imagery is in places drawn directly from the film adaptation of the eponymous Year, starring John Hurt as Winston Smith. V for Vendetta goes to the lengths of casting John Hurt, taking the truism that all writers are plagiarists to an extent not envisaged or envied by the authors of said maxim. Here Hurt plays the Chancellor, the High Chancellor, High Brother, Big Chancellor, whatever, who, via all the least imaginative means depicted by Orwell, the thuggish secret police, the banning of books and art, but using precious few of the more creative and inventive devices he imagined, Newspeak, the control of language, based on the strong form of the Strauss-Worfian hypothesis, keeps the people suppressed and compliant. The party in V for Vendetta is explicitly depicted as a fascist totalitarian state, which is easy and uncomplicated, and so can easily be grasped by the film's target audience, who are expected to do as Aldous Huxley portrayed the subjects of his Brave New World as doing at the movies, watch it with their eyes open and their brains dormant, enjoying the pretty lights and the feelies. This is the lazy man's version of Orwell's Oceania, of course, which came about as a result of a socialist revolution, along seemingly Leninist lines, and fell to tyranny precisely in the manner Rosa Luxemburg warned would occur in the Soviet Union. Ingsoc in 1984 thus makes sense, it being newspeak for English socialism, a la the National Socialism of Hitler's Germany. It is unfashionable but profitable to point out the lack of practical distinction between communist and fascist means, and because it is unfashionable and profitable and requires one to do a little bit of thinking, the Wachowskis, who exhausted themselves in The Matrix and never stopped to replenish their diminished reserves, don't bother with it. We all hate fascism, though very few people know what it is, another of Orwell's points they probably should have borrowed from, and it was fashionable then as it is now for leftist larpers to pretend it is all around us. So straightforward off-the-shelf fascism is what we get. Norse fire sounds vaguely fascistic, though it completely lacks the context and meaning of and the implications behind Ingsoc, so Norse fire is what they call the party. Never mind that the Norse myths don't deserve it. Never mind that there's no historical analogue in England to the Nazi fetishization of aspects of Norse mythology. Never mind that Norse mythology was so thoroughly expunged from England, from the Romans onwards, that Tolkien had to create the Lord of the Rings to compensate for its absence. No, Norse fire it is. It sounds evil. It'll do. Wikipedia, that beacon of objective truth that has absolutely not been captured by the left, no matter what its co-founder says, claims that this alternative future, whatever that means, is fairly plausible, which is one of those comments that wants only to be underlined. The real-world context is, of course, the war on terror. Hence Roger Allam doing what must have been intended by the Wachowskis, if not by Allam himself, as a parody of Christopher Hitchens, spectacularly missing several points there, as is the film's not especially endearing habit. Hitchens was the most eloquent exponent of the war against Islamofascism, with which the film tacitly places its sympathies, eloquent morally as well as linguistically, and he was a keener student of Orwell than the Wachowskis, with a much firmer grasp than they on the basics that make states like that depicted in V for Vendetta impossible, free speech for one. 2005 saw the war in Afghanistan in its fourth year and the war against Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq in its second. The anti-war movement was 2005 saw the war in Afghanistan in its fourth year, and the war against Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq in its second. The anti-movement was at, or at least approaching, its peak, both in paranoia and in volume, and was only further incensed by the decisive re-election of George W. Bush in the year before. Many Democrats hadn't quite gotten over their own Stop the Steal moment in 2000 that we are now supposed to pretend never happened. It's this that V for Vendetta takes as its moral inspiration, the state of the world on which it comments, repeating almost every lazy assumption, parodying every boneheaded depiction, and falling for all the worst arguments of the anti-war left at that time. Hitchens is here, combined with a kind of parody Bill O'Reilly on a cheap parody of Fox News. Fox News does not require parody, but even Fox News is too subtle for V for Vendetta, and so we get an early taste of the film's soul flavour, all-encompassing like tomato ketchup. He's explicitly Christian, he detests Muslims, and loathes homosexuals. Britain, as anyone who has spent any time here will know, is a remarkably un-Christian country with no shortage of Muslims or homosexuals, and criticism of both is verboten. Hitchens was a stern critic of Islam, but also of Christianity, and was not himself immune to the gay. Skillful parody brings out the excesses of the subject being parodied, but this film is not skillful in any respect. We follow Evie, played by Natalie Portman, who should have done better films by now, who was accosted early on by a rapey type and rescued by V, played by Hugo Weaving, who has done many better films. The Wachowskis have a nasty habit of vomiting the contents of a thesaurus as a substitute for creating character, and so V's first lines of dialogue read something like the architect of The Matrix if the architect had been binging on An Idiot's Guide to Shakespeare. Weaving does a good job with what he's given, which is too much, not too little, but his line's great in the first scene, and anybody who watches the film, and minded to pay attention, must settle down for a long and irritating ride. They are teleported to the top of a building, where they watch the Old Bailey, one of England's oldest and most iconic sites and symbols of justice, explode in fireworks, accompanied by Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, which is a theme that recurs throughout the film, and, though effective, is not obviously relevant to proceedings. The 1812 Overture was composed to celebrate the victory of the Russians over Napoleon. But besides the defeat of a dictator, it has no clear thematic link. The Russian victory, in fact, aided the British, for one thing, and Russia was at that time ruled by a not especially likeable emperor in Alexander I, who enacted the kind of oppression the film otherwise pretends to rail against. Evie works for the British Television Network, that Fox News equivalent. One wonders how such a thing could come about in a country where the ruling class thinks the milquetoast GB News is too extreme for decent folk. She's now being investigated by Stephen Ray's Detective Finch, who provides us with about 5 seconds of backstory via a telescreen in his car. Her parents are dead, they were political activists, and therefore she is suspicious. They try to arrest her at BTN, but she evades them. Meanwhile, V hacks the station and forces it to broadcast a message of rebellion, again with the 1812 Overture as his accompaniment, though it's not clear here whether this is in-universe or extra-universe. He informs the people that the state they live in is not very nice. There's something terribly wrong, he says, as though they didn't know all of this already, and we see a shot of Stephen Fry's character, Gordon Dietrich, who seems inspired. V claims credit for destroying the Old Bailey, which the regime had previously tried to pretend was a planned demolition. There are seeming overtures here to the kind of Bin Laden-esque videos Al-Qaeda would at that time publish after their latest atrocity. The single character in front of a single camera claiming credit for this explosion, that death. Put as charitably as possible, these similarities are unfortunate. Put a little less charitably, it's both creative and morally sickening to adopt terrorist chic in the name of radicalism. But again, this is a film of its time, and its time was not short of moral cretins willing to make points like this, while either not grasping or not bothering to consider the message that's actually being sent. V enters the building and murders a few policemen with some Tchaikovsky brand knife work, assisted by Evie, who maces a detective in the face to distract him while V continues his attack. Are you keeping up, by the way? We're only about 15 minutes in. State broadcasts brand V a terrorist and claim to have killed him. This seems to upset the viewing public, which suggests the suppressive power of the state isn't that great. Orwell's 1984, the film isn't sorry to keep bringing this up, so I'm not either, does this much more effectively, creating an atmosphere of claustrophobic isolation in which nobody trusts anybody enough to express a thought or a feeling that has the slightest chance of being thought deviant. V for Vendetta utterly fails to generate anything like the same atmosphere. Indeed, it does next to nothing to actually build the world it constantly tells us our characters inhabit. Thus far, we've seen none of the violent oppression that supposedly characterises Northfire's England. We've seen John Hurt's sinister-looking High Brother Big Chancellor being very unhappy at V's actions. We know that state TV is a propaganda channel and its host has some unpalatable opinions. But that's pretty much it. Thus far, the only violence is done by V, who plants explosives with reckless abandon and kills policemen with a kind of glee, though they are quite obviously normal coppers, and in trying to arrest a terrorist who has just blown up a building, are doing no more than their job when they try to stop him. Obviously, in universe, we have to proceed from the premise that everything V says is true. He is the de facto narrator and the voice of the Wachowskis. But the rule of good drama has historically been to show, not tell. And thus far we have only his word to take for the violent repression enacted by the state, while all we've been shown is his own penchant for extreme and flamboyant violence. He and Evie escape back to a swanky-looking apartment full of art, musical instruments. We are supposed to infer that all these things are banned by the state. V cooks Eve breakfast, and they debate the merits of blowing up Parliament. The film has one or two good lines. People shouldn't be afraid of their government should be afraid of the people. And one or two exceptionally bad ones. In the context of pre-9/11 America, the line, blowing up a building can change the world, undoubtedly resonates, but here, again, it is spoken by a terrorist with whom we are invited to sympathise. Also, people afraid of their government is, of course, a bad thing. Government should be afraid of the people, but by that we mean the government can be kicked out in an election. If a government fears that the people will overthrow it violently and shoot them in the streets and blow up the Houses of Parliament, I would suggest that is not a fear conducive to a healthy, functioning society. This isn't so much an inversion of expectations as it is a deliberate and cheap attempt to be edgy by the film, playing, again, if the film keeps doing this, I'm going to keep making this point, on the worst tendencies of the anti-war movement, which did a very good job giving the impression it was pro-war but for the other side. We learn that Hallam's Hitchens used to be a concentration camp guard and V kills him. How he got there we don't know, how far away it is from his home we don't know, how much time has elapsed since we last saw him we don't know. He teleports back for the next scene where the sound of him practicing swordplay against a suit of armour whilst watching the Count of Monte Cristo wakes Evie up. So we are left to assume that the most wanted man in England lives in a lavish flat within a relatively short distance from the home of the state broadcaster's lead presenter. V and Evie watch the Count of Monte Cristo together. Natalie Portman continues to underutilise her talents, though this is largely thanks to the George Lucas-level dialogue. The Count of Monte Cristo is incidentally a very good book, and you would be better off reading that than watching this film. The news announces the death of Christopher Hitchens. Evie learns that V used her ID to break into the building and kill him. Violence can be used for good, he says, and for justice. A complex moral point that the film devotes precisely 10 seconds to before cutting back to Detective Finch, who is starting to fill in a few gaps. Hitchens, whose transition from concentration camp guard to TV broadcaster is not quite believable, is traced back to a mysterious facility, but when Finch tries to find out what the facility was used for, he is met with obstruction from the man. He presses him on a point that, again, he would not press in that way, were he living under a real dictatorship. Stephen Ray also plays a detective in the much superior film Citizen X, set in the Soviet Union, and that film takes care to ensure the audience appreciates the risk of a lowly detective questioning authority. Once again, that would require some work and a little subtlety, so this film doesn't bother with it at all. Flicking back to Evie again, we are treated to a flashback of her parents being murdered, though Natalie Portman narrates this as though she were reading an instruction manual for a slow cooker. She pledges to help V in whatever way she can, though in the last scene she seemed a little shocked about his willingness to use violence to achieve his ends. Her moral dilemma was given precisely as much time as the audience had to consider it, which is to say, none at all. Though books are banned, she recognises a quotation from Faust, and she becomes temporarily Australian. Detective Finch tracks down another former concentration camp chap. This one is a bishop, which is not as unbelievable as the Catholic Church might wish it to be, but one is still struck by the extraordinary social mobility under this regime. We follow the bishop back to his place of work. Evie is in his bedroom, dressed as a kind of clown doll, the implication being she is a prostitute. It transpires she's trying to double-cross V and tries to tell the bishop that V is coming to kill him in return for some kind of protection, though she still left the window open for V to get in. Were she trying to foil his plot, she might at least have left it locked. And so V kills the bishop. The plot here is attempting to do an extended riff on the Count of Monte Cristo, which is why we were shown it earlier. V is going around killing those who wronged him in the past. But still, we are given nothing to make his motive at all desirable. The Count of Monte Cristo sets up the protagonist's tragedy at the start, explains the injustice done against him, shows us the state in which he lives, and leaves us in little doubt that what he is doing is the only thing he can possibly do. And by the end we realise that not even he believes his motives are purely honourable. The Count of Monte Cristo also lives in a world in which he has no recourse to the law for redress of grievance, while here we have again only V's word to take for the world's violent indifference. V for Vendetta takes the opposite line anyway, showing us nothing to begin with, and portraying violence as honourable in its own right, an opinion that is only reinforced as the film progresses. This, it seems to me, is precisely the wrong way about, and every time the film attempts to draw on literature for its source material, it only highlights its deficiencies when compared with those same texts. Evie escapes to Stephen Fry's house. It is a truth universally acknowledged that Stephen Fry cannot act, but is in some ineffable way lovable. He can't act here, and has had no character development up until this point. For an English audience, it trades on his established reputation, but one wonders what an American really gets from his character. I'm not an American and do not have one to hand, but I can't imagine Fry's character comes pre-packaged with Fry's affable domestic reputation. Fry, too, lives in a nice flat with lots of contraband art. Once again, this would not have happened in 1984. It's one thing for V to have got a hold of this stuff, but it seems All and Sundry can get a hold of it too. This only further undermines the image we are supposed to have of a ruthless tyranny under which they live. Fry's character has a copy of the Quran, which he extols. He is also gay in life as in art. It is again a sign of the vacuity of this film's guiding philosophy that no contradiction is here recognised. The Quran does indeed contain some fairly beautiful passages, albeit many of these are lifted straight from the Bible. But it also condemns people like Stephen Fry, and I must say like me, to death, within its first 20 pages, 4 times. And when one looks at the world now, and indeed when one looks at the world as it was then, we find that the ideology actually dedicated to setting up the kind of regime featured in V for Vendetta, one that is rabidly religious, that detests diversity, that beats up and murders gays, that bans art and music and speech, is motivated almost without fail by that book Fry's character extols. The film extols violence as a means to overthrow such a regime, while the thrust of its commentary is that the war on terror is a bad thing, and one can't have this both ways. Norsefire barely rises to the ankles of the Saddam Hussein regime, which had a penchant for turning its own people into glue. Is violence against these regimes desirable, or isn't it? Muslims most affected was a cry that came to prominence in the early years post 9/11 that has only gained currency since. That this film should take the side of the supposedly oppressed minority, evidence for this oppression is not forthcoming, is tediously predictable, the kind of milquetoast edginess that the faux radical left finds to be terribly persuasive. The kind of person convinced by this substitute for thought is exactly the type of person to enjoy this film's talentless propaganda. Finch works out that all the people V is killing once worked with a mysterious facility. There's only one left who lives in hiding and turns out to be the coroner he shared a scene with 5 minutes ago, conveniently enough. All this happens at a terrible rush. It's night time now, she's in bed, V's in her room. They share a heart-to-heart, and she explains that she did what she did out of hope. He says he hasn't come because of what she hoped to do, but because of what she did. I said at the off this film gave expression to a modern form of totalitarianism, and one of its features is that it considers intent entirely redundant. Actions are all that matter. Suffice it to say, the film devotes not even a second to exploring this moral quandary either. V kills her. The High Chancellor gives Finch a stern ticking off, and specifically enjoins him against pursuing the only lead he has. Then we're treated to another flashback, this time narrated by the Doctor, who has just been killed, exploring the mysterious facility and its uses. Human experimentation, mass graves, testing viruses. Only one case shows any hope, etc. Antiviral medication has the happy side effect of giving the patient superhuman reflexes. On November the 5th, the facility explodes for some reason, and a naked and eyeless and heavily CGI'd V emerges from the flames. Then we're back with Finch for about 5 seconds, and then Stephen Fry is cooking Evie at breakfast again, the same breakfast V made, which is supposed to be significant. Honestly, the pacing in this film is abysmal. Scene cuts to scene cuts to scene. Like an Adam Curtis documentary, it's done so quickly that the audience doesn't really have time to rest, or to think, or to consider, or to spot the bad writing. The next scene with Detective Finch indulges in another favourite pastime of the anti-war left, false flag theorising. Finch posits that the worst chemical attack in this country's history was not carried out by religious extremists, but was in fact the work of the British government. Now, I know we don't really do the teaching of history anymore, but surely it doesn't take much imagination to understand the meaning of this messaging in the context in which it was made. The false flag theory of 9/11 is the sole preserve of the most disgusting type of crank. Positing false flag theories in a film that is so clearly intended as a piece of cultural commentary on post-9/11 America is more than careless, it's pretty damn disgusting, and one can't help but feel V for Vendetta would have been treated far more harshly by the critical press then as well as now, were it not for its clearly advertised political affiliations. Stephen Fry's character, also a TV host, somehow smuggles a comedy skit past the censors of this oppressive totalitarian state, one that mocks the High Chancellor. This is probably the least competent dictatorship ever devised in fiction, save for those explicitly designed for comedic purposes. The secret police bust in at night to beat him up and drag him away in a hood, in a call back to Evie's parents being disappeared, but this doesn't make up for the fact that anybody can apparently do anything, and the state merely reacts to events. No dictatorship could last more than a few months with this appalling level of incompetence. At least the Nazis were efficient. Evie is ostensibly captured by the secret police and put through the ringer, but this all turns out to have been a ruse by V to test her loyalty. During her time in prison, she uncovers a bit of a diary hidden in a cell wall written by someone called Valerie, which prompts another flashback with a warm, fuzzy camera, as Valerie tells us how she met her girlfriend and how she came out to her parents, who hated it, obviously. Now, I'm not straight, but I don't think you have to be gay to find this kind of thing effective when it's done well. This scene is an attempt to inject some much-needed humanity into V for Vendetta. The characters have thus far been excuses for the plot to happen. They are none of them particularly human. But the fact that it is sepia-tinted both literally in the camera work and figuratively in its depiction of a rosy relationship, the cliché coming-out angst that's always deployed when films want to use gay people to make political points, deprives it of what genuine sentiment it might otherwise have expressed. And it neatly encapsulates one of the constant problems with the film. The narrative of the note jumps instantly from lovey-dovey lesbian idyls to "but then America's war got worse," and then from there straight to dictatorship in England, ushered in apparently by the closing of the London Underground. Right. This is barely serviceable as a rough draft, a sketch of a plot. It's the post-it notes you draw up as you plan your outline. It categorically does not work as a finished product, light-speed skipping as it does, over vast tracts of unexplored space where world-building should be. Evie passes this test, realises it's all a con, emerges from prison to find she's been in V's basement all along, and the abiding question is just how big is his fucking house? The first thing Evie objects to is the fact he shaved her hair, naturally. She's not very happy with him. Evie's English accent falters when she's angry. But V explains it all, and Evie has a panic attack and does her Padme giving birth face, and then they go out onto the roof in the rain, and we're treated to intermittent flashbacks of V emerging from the fire at the mysterious lab, because otherwise you might have missed the equivalence being drawn here. It says something about this film's understanding of what subtlety is and where it lies that it feels it necessary to point this out. It likewise feels it necessary to have a long scene, one of the longest single scenes in the film, explaining that V is doing what he's doing to get back at those who made him a monster, the Count of Monte Cristo thing again, that anybody paying attention spotted about an hour ago. This again reveals a lot, this time about what the film expects of its audience, which is not much. Evie leaves, V has a cry, And we cut back to Finch, who is trying to tell the High Chancellor that an attack on Parliament is likely to come from the tunnels beneath Parliament, because Guy Fawkes, remember? Only one mention has previously been made of an attack on Parliament, and this film has this nasty habit of attempting to divert people's attention from things that are actually important. This was mentioned once and then let go, and now it's back as a key crux moment in the film. The state is peddling more lies, and people in pubs are openly calling it bullshit. How? How did this state ever come to exist? What is the point of bigging up the banning of books and the controlling of speech if anyone can get books and say what they like? How do people take this shit seriously? The current British government exercises more control, more competently, over the people using coronavirus guidance than this totalitarian state does, and the current British government is a collection of extraordinarily incompetent cucks. V, in disguise, meets with Finch and tells him all about the High Chancellor, the worst aspects of whom are that he is highly religious and a member of the Conservative Party. In the space of about 30 seconds, it puts strips of flesh on the bones of the false flag bioweapons attack hinted at earlier. I'm not going to go back over why this threadbare plotline is disgusting, other than to say that it completes this aspect of the social commentary and leaves the watcher in no doubt what it's trying to say, and that's foul. It's just foul. If you want proof that the country it's besmirching by scant remove is not the country the writers think it is, the mere existence of this film and its critical popularity provides that proof. It is attacking a myth, a fever dream of the proto-woke left. It's fundamentally unserious, except that it is popular. Except that, as I said at the outset, it is a symbol of its time, revealing much about that time, and what it reveals is, put politely as possible, deeply unpleasant. Lots of people are graffitiing the V sign all over London, and the Guy Fawkes mask is being posted in the fucking mail to houses all over the city, and Finch has gained the power of foresight somehow, and I can't really be bothered anymore. This film doesn't take you seriously, and you shouldn't take it seriously either. It's just a joke. The whole thing's bollocks. The police shoot someone wearing one of the masks, and the people rise up, and one of them smacks him in the face with a wrench. The army's on the streets to keep order. V spent several years setting up more dominoes than should exist in the whole world, and knocks them down for dramatic effect. And there's chaos on the streets that were never under control to begin with, but they're all fighting the evil power. And Evie and V dance before a jukebox, and it turns out Evie has avoided detection because she has a fucking fake ID like every other teenager in the country. I mean, really, ugh. Just whatever, film, whatever. Oh, and there's another sinister meeting with Big Brother, who says that if the terrorists succeed in blowing up the Houses of Parliament, he'll be reading Creedy's resignation instead of a newspaper. Creedy was introduced earlier for no apparent reason other than a...
Look, your little game of going over people's heads is over. You can still work, but from now on you answer to me. You got that?
Excuse me, who's in charge here?
I am.
Yeah, well, not anymore, you're not. This department has just been assigned to the FBI.
That's outrageous. On whose order?
On order of the Secretary of Defense. You had your shot, now I'm in charge.
Not anymore, you're not. Orders just came down from Central. They want ATF handling this on all fronts. All right, people, from now on you're answering to me.
Not anymore, they're not. Orders from the President. He wants this handled by his staff personally.
Moment with Finch. But that's it. A resignation. He's had people killed for reading books occasionally, but if terrorists blow up Westminster, he'll demand a resignation. Also, why does he care about Westminster? Westminster's significance is as the home of British democracy, which in this film does not exist. We're not told of any actual use for the building under the dictatorship that I can recall. And Parliament has historically been a symbol of democracy, of anti-fascism. It was, belatedly but eventually, in Parliament that the decision to go to war against Hitler was made. Why, except that the premise and the plot needs it to happen, is V targeting Parliament at all? What's its function? How is destroying a democratic chamber, or the symbol of an old democracy now lost, a good thing? This is another part of the film's bonkers morality. It's a symptom of its thoughtless radicalism. When in the Avengers, S.H.I.E.L.D. is overtaken by Hydra, the goal is to destroy Hydra in order to reclaim what Hydra has besmirched, the fundamental dignity of the nation. The problem is precisely that the symbols of the common ideal have been corrupted and undermined and must therefore be saved. It is an attempt, successful, to reclaim the system, broadly defined, not to overthrow it, not to destroy all its institutions. Reform, not revolution, affirmation, not negation. But not in V for Vendetta. There the opposite is true. And then the Chancellor is murdered in the tube, and I can't anymore recall why or how this has happened, why or how he got there. The new big bad is Creedy, who at least won't have to hand in his resignation anymore. V is surrounded by goons, everyone shoots him, but he's cool because he's had the COVID vaccine and it gave him superpowers. We're treated to bullet time knife throwing, V moving at super speed, killing all the goons before they have time to reload. Creedy shoots him again, but V obviously had the Pfizer vaccine and a booster shot because he survives that too and chokes Creedy to death. But no. It turns out he was wearing a very thin sheet of metal on his chest that stopped most of the bullets, except those that it didn't. I think this counts as partial plot armor, because it means he doesn't die immediately and instead stumbles to meet Evie in front of a tube train. I seem to recall some mention of the tunnels being blocked, and I also distinctly recall a flashback where it's explained that the fascists took over by stopping the trains, which is a new one. Normally they make them run on time. Were they cleared? Is that a thing that happened? Why are there still working trains? Don't know, don't remember. V professes his love, Evie doesn't want him to die, but he does. And then we get the inaugural Million-Masked March, as thousands of masked people march on Trafalgar Square and across the Thames. And the troops stand down because the High Chancellor is dead, and so is Creedy, and there's no such thing as a chain of command in this god-awful non-dictatorship. Evie explains that the country needs hope more than it needs a building, and that's the reason for blowing up Parliament. She sends the tube train off with V's body inside and a load of bombs. Nobody's driving it. The unions insist they can't drive on their own, but here they can. The 1812 Overture blares again. It's testimony to the power of that piece, that even this film can't make me hate it. The sight of Parliament being blown up to that score is an offence against culture, not a crime the score abets. Oh, and Finch is there, but he's pretty much on side now, and so it's irrelevant. The fireworks go off. All the people watch Parliament blow up, including the people who died earlier in the film, because reasons. But why? You've already overthrown the regime. You've already killed the High Chancellor. The people have already risen up. The regime has already fallen. What's achieved then? What happens next? Where's the seat of power? Why would you not reclaim what was taken from you? Why would you blow up the symbol of democracy, the symbol of anti-fascist resistance throughout the war against actual fascists and Nazis, rather than the ones that just exist in the Tchaikovsky brother-sisters' heads? Fuck me. A brief aside on the coronavirus pandemic is, I think, essential. Other reviewers have made the point that a world falling to a fascist dictatorship following a deadly virus has an eerie resonance for modern times. It's easy to see why, and reading the film through this lens injects a new, modern energy to its symbol. Government overreach in response to the COVID-19 pandemic is a worldwide issue. Much could be said about it, and will be said about it on this channel in other videos. But it would be a mistake to allow our own immediate circumstances to overshadow the circumstances in which the film was made, or to forget the intended allegory, in favour of the one that is more convenient to us today. It is notable that support for the strongest, strictest, and longest impositions on civil liberties in response to the virus is, in fact, coming from the left of politics, with the right, where it is in power, being occasionally opposed to these measures to court, but more often adopting moderated versions of the policies advocated by the left. To say that they are moderated is not to excuse them, nor an attempt to denude them of their significance. They are moderate only by comparison with the demands of the other side. But when the comparison is made with the ordinary way of doing things, these supposedly moderate measures rightly emerge as extreme. But this fact has two significant consequences. A, it robs the left of what claim it might have to the radical or libertarian interpretation of the film, since the regimes making most use of the emergency powers passed during COVID are at least nominally of their own side. I don't intend to get into the argument about whether fascism is of the left or the right wing. I tend to think strict fascism is of the left, while other systems that are strikingly similar but that are also distinct, like Franco's Falangism in Spain, are of the right. If we accept that fascism is a right-wing phenomenon, then reading the film as a parable about a virus leading to emergency powers which usher in a fascist state is simply not viable, because those making use of those emergency powers are not, by and large, of the political right. The second consequence is, in fact, a negation. One can choose to reinterpret the film in the light of current events, but the conclusion, on which more in due course, remains the same. The choice is between revolution and reclamation, between the sweeping away of the past and the winning back of what was good about it. COVID-19 and the emergency powers enacted by governments no more justify the kind of revolution depicted in and called for by V for Vendetta than the original context does. Its revolution remains a lazy, thought-free kind of radicalism that is at best cliché and lazy and at worst dangerous, and a real and present threat to the very people the radicals pretend to care about and speak for. But now I have to attempt to regain the tone with which I began this critique, which is hard because this film is just abysmal, morally and technically. The final scene, and those questions with which I ended, are important. They bring us back to what this film captures, what it symbolises, what it represents, and what the symbols it birthed, and the people who wear them, stand for today. The British state and the American state following the Civil War represent a vision of a political and cultural community. The White House and the Houses of Parliament stand in the form of cathedrals consecrated to this common ideal, a secular ideal, democracy first and foremost, representation, the franchise. They house the representatives of the people, not the rulers over them. The Queen in the United Kingdom is not permitted entry to the House of Commons for precisely this reason, and the House of Commons has supremacy over the House of Lords for the same reason. America has kept several of the parliamentary traditions that were born in Britain, an expression of the correct interpretation of history which holds that the American Revolution against British rule was in fact an extension of the glorious revolution begun in Britain more than a century prior. Revolutions are, however, the exception in both countries, which have evolved their political systems principally through a process of reform. The American Revolution remains extraordinary for being perhaps the only revolution in the long and sorry history of human affairs that was actually successful, but was so because, rather than doing as the French, the Nazis, and the Soviets all did in their own way, resetting the clocks and calendars to year zero, it claimed its place as the continuance of an eons-long system of progress, of continuity, seeing the monarchic oppression as a break in the tide of history, not the defining feature of it. History was the inspiration, not the villain. The American revolutionaries sought to reassert a system of natural rights, of natural justice discovered by common law. They sought to reclaim known rights and ancient liberties, rights that, under the legal system which they notably did not seek to overthrow, always existed, that predated the state. Magna Carta was an earlier and imperfect expression of the same concept, that the rights of the British and of the Americans are a shared inheritance, not the inventions of a revolutionary guard, of a revolutionary commune, of a revolutionary vanguard or party. The closing scene of V for Vendetta is ironic. It is set to the tune composed to celebrate a victory over the French, which helped the British, even as it celebrates the demise of a British institution and espouses an idea of revolution which the French pioneered, one which does not seek to reclaim but rather to create, and one that does so by sweeping away the old. Thomas Paine, unofficial founding father of the United States, warned against this when he was invited by the Marquis de Lafayette to speak at the French Assembly, following the French Revolution. He counselled against the execution of the Ancien regime, perceiving correctly that a state birthed in the blood of the old order would have to be sustained by blood from then on. The same is true of every revolution which has proceeded on this model, from Russia to Cuba to China. Revolutions eat their own, the saying goes. Or as David Starkey rightly says, revolutions replicate the worst features of the Ancien regime. Quite apart from its manifest flaws as a work of art, the message imparted by the closing scene of V for Vendetta is revolutionary in the continental sense. It is the needless destruction of a thing that has already been beaten, a wiping away of all that is good about the past, rather than a reclamation of it from some aberrant impostor regime. No state founded in this way will survive without recourse to exactly the kind of tyranny the film tries and fails to rail against. But it is also revolutionary in the modern sense, which has no real conception of itself. What comes after it is never addressed, the obvious implications are never explored or discussed, the clear consequences, obvious as they are too much of a burden for the film's cognitive load. It knows what it hates and it wants to get rid of it by the easy recourse to lazy and mindless violence. But that is the extent of its vision. It's intellectually bankrupt. At least the French took the time to theorize. The film was born, as has already been said, in the fevered atmosphere of post-9/11 America. But it has resonance today because the moment it captured and the symbols it created to represent those moments and convey their message are the direct antecedent to our present discontents. It spoke to, and in the form of anonymous and occupy it clothed, a substantial portion of the population that is utterly aloof to its own history, and that embraces the kind of thoughtless radicalism that produces the most capricious and tyrannical of regimes. Its wanton indulgence of the worst kind of conspiracist thinking, its attitude to the culture and the country that raised it, which transcends mere nihilism and manifests as utterly masochistic, its creation of a new form of radical chic, and a whole class of useful idiots made ideologically vulnerable to the charisma of the true believers, is symptomatic of a sickness already deep set in 2005, but which we have done absolutely nothing to counter since. The disease has been allowed to fester. Films like this were clear warnings at the time, but those warnings weren't heeded. The radicalization of the miseducated middle classes, historically the backbone of the worst revolutions in the long, sorry history of human species, including the Nazis, was allowed to continue. Whole generations have now been brought up with a desire to sweep away the past, not to reclaim what was good about it. The common ideal, the common vision, the common human aspirations that once broadly, not totally, never completely, but broadly united us, have been allowed to fail, to be replaced by a revolutionary cast that hates what it doesn't know and doesn't know what it wants of the future. V for Vendetta didn't cause this. Its popularity is a symptom of a malaise that predates it. Contingency is built on contingency, it is turtles all the way down, but it has certainly fueled it. The neo-hippies of the Occupy movement that arose after the 2008 crash, blaming capitalism for the failures of government intervention and calling for a revolution to overthrow the system that has alleviated more poverty, misery and privation around the world than at any other time in human history, and to usher in as its replacement a system that has impoverished every inch of land it has ever ruled over, sported the Forks masks from V for Vendetta. Likewise the LARPing nerds of Anonymous. The film gives, as I said at the outset, symbolic expression to the idiot radicalism that was emerging then and is flourishing today. As I began by saying, film gives us an insight into the health of the culture in the now, giving us glimpses of conditions that may not fully metastasize until much later. We ought to treat them much more seriously than we do, even when they are as objectively crap on artistic grounds as V for Vendetta is. At present, we have the hopeful, optimistic and communal philosophy that underpinned the Avengers, but in this medium, the Avengers is, I think, the only exponent of that mindset. Arraigned against it is a host of films of the opposite ideology, of that expounded by V for Vendetta. I think the popularity of the Avengers is a cause for some optimism, and likewise the proven fact that if you go woke, you go broke. But we shouldn't be complacent about it. Unchecked, the cancer grows, and if we don't treat it now, we may find it is too late.